Thanks for the opportunity for giving a talk today on the topic of introducing hard-to-like foods to infants and toddlers. First, I'd like you to picture this. A mom has gone to the store. She's bought a particular food that she's interested in introducing to her 20-month-old son. She buys the food, she goes home, she cooks it, she prepares it, she blends it up for her child and is so excited to offer it to them. And the child explodes in a temper tantrum and cries, "No!" And that's the end of it. Imagine how that mom is feeling. And also imagine how the child is feeling. I want to talk to you today about both mothers' and children's perspectives when each is trying to take on learning to accept a novel food. I like this photograph because I think it says quite a lot about it. It's a long and very winding road. I want you to take a moment and consider for yourself, do you believe that food preferences are inborn, or are they made by experience? Or perhaps a little bit of both. So just take a moment and think about that. I'm going to suggest to you that it's a little bit of both. That there's both an inborn piece where we understand that we have reflexive responses to certain tastes. Most babies, when they taste something sweet, start to smile. And if it's sour or bitter, they're more likely to grimace or gape. On the other hand, we know that exposure to new foods and experience that's positive with them can lead to acceptance and learning to regulate in the face of that new experience of a novel food. There are also environmental factors, like does the family have access to different kinds of foods and availability given to the child? Culturally, is it part of their food lexicon and what they're used to serving? And there are also individual level factors at the level of the child. Some children are just more reluctant to try new things, including foods, than others, and others are surgent and very excited to try everything new. There's the limitation that can be imposed by SES. How much money and availability is in the area for each family to be able to purchase and potentially waste new foods? How do parents eat themselves? And what are their feeding practices for their children and their beliefs about the proper way to feed children? Each of these has an impact on how food preferences are determined. I'm going to suggest to you that another piece that comes up, especially during the period of complementary feeding, is how much development is exploding during the time of 6 months of age to 24 months of age when we first start introducing children to different foods that the family eats. Children grow and develop, they gain motor control, and they begin to have the ability to self-feed. They also start having a really high desire to do everything for themselves, and food refusal tends to increase over that time period. Children start eating less. They're not as hungry. And this can lead to significant parental confusion. Is it that they're just not hungry? Do they not like the food? Are they having a bad day and displaying their independence? Are they ill or are they teething? All of these signals can complicate child feeding during this time period. And if that weren't enough, the trait of neophobia, or that reluctance to try new foods, begins to emerge during that exact same time frame. I would summarize by saying during that time, feeding's just not much fun. And parents and caregivers are faced with doing that not so fun task many times each day. To think about a model of how all those different components go together in influencing children's food acceptance patterns, I've displayed one such model here that we've developed. It takes into account that there are specific child traits as well as environmental inputs into whether or not a child is actually even exposed to a target food. Once that decision is made to offer that food, exposure can occur once, it can occur many times, but is necessary for producing familiarity. And familiarity, learning about that food and coming to trust that food, is really what seems to influence children's willingness to try, along with sensory learning, feeling it, touching it, smelling it, licking it. And all these things go into whether or not a child develops a preference for that particular flavor in food. Not to mention the fact that the emotional tone of the experience in which children have these different interactions with food all play a part as well. And all of this has to happen in child learning before children significantly increase their consumption of a target food. I think sometimes, though, we skip a lot of those steps, that parents may not be necessarily aware of them, or in our rush or excitement to have them try something new, we go straight from the target food expecting a lot of consumption. And that's where things begin to fall apart from time to time. We know that repeated exposure works. We in the laboratory and in academics and in the professional setting know it works. But we don't know that much about what moms know and what they think about it and what they do when children reject a food. And so we undertook what we call the Persistence Project to try to understand that experience of food rejection from the standpoint of the mom or the parent or the caregiver that has the responsibility and the opportunity to repeatedly expose a child to a food that they're rejecting. When we asked parents in an online survey, and this was about 200 parents in a convenience sample, what you see is kind of a bimodal distribution on this graph, where there are parents who expose their kids somewhere around 3 to 5 times to a food that gets rejected. And there are those that are clearly getting the message that most of us know about, that it may take as many as 8 to 10 or more exposures before children learn to like something. I kind of group these parents into 4 different categories. They're the people I call the let it go or the one and done. They do it one time. If the child doesn't like it, it's over. They move on to something else. There are parents who hang in there for a while, but maybe not enough times for exposure to really have significant effects. There are those who've clearly gotten the message, the 8 to 10 exposure people. And then there's this fairly significant group of people I call those who never give up. They say, I'm never giving up. It's really important to me. I want these children to like this food, so I'm going to continue to offer it as long as it takes. And thus the Good Taste study was born. We were interested in bringing parent-child dyads into the laboratory during that tricky period of 6 to 24 months of age to observe maternal interactions in response to offering foods that are difficult to learn to like, in this case, a dark green vegetable. We looked at it from the perspective of the mother and what her perception of the child's reaction was, but we also videotaped these interactions and trained coders to observe children's behaviors and their level of acceptance of the food. At the end of the visit, we interviewed mothers and got their thoughts on repeated exposure, whether and how they go about it, and what it feels like to undergo child food rejection during this period of time. This gives you an idea of the things that we ask moms to offer their young children. We had a control food, which was a rice cereal, just to get them used to being in the lab and having food offered there. But we also offered them 4 bitter green vegetable purees. And in this case, it was pureed kale that we asked them to offer their child. This is a listing of the characteristics of both children. So what you can see is they were about half boys. They were typically developing. And Their ages ranged across that 6 to 24 month period. I want you to particularly notice, however, who showed up, who volunteered to be in our study. It was largely highly educated mothers who were middle income or higher and very predominantly white. So care needs to be taken in generalizing the findings of our study to a larger group. Instead of me exclusively telling you the results of our study, I'd like to show you a few short video clips that give you some snapshots of children's different reactions to those kale purees. Here's the first one. Clearly, this was a good response. This child loved this food and ate every bite willingly and with anticipation, with a high rate of acceptance. Let's take a look at the next one.
You ready? Wow. Oh.
That mom really hung in there and tried to encourage her child to eat the food, but with not at all the same result as the previous video clip.
You ready?
Let's take a look at one last one.
No, this one's different. You don't know that. This one's new. Can you just taste a little bit?
Clearly, this child wasn't even willing to take the first bite to find out whether they would like it, because they knew before they ever even started that they weren't going to like it, despite this mother's persuasion to at least attempt to try it. This child hated it before they even tried it. So rather than just these specific examples, I want to give you some broad brushstrokes of what we found from all of the 106 mother-children dyads that engaged in our study in the lab. For children who are around 6 months of age, it was interesting. They accepted almost every single bite that was offered to them, irrespective of whether they liked it or not. They may have had the same grimace and gape that you saw in that second video, but when the spoon was loaded up with another bite and brought towards their mouth, they opened their mouth and they ate it anyway. It was almost as though seeing food on a spoon at that age was a reflex to open their mouth rather than being under their individual control. By 12 months of age, they mostly accepted the bites, but they started to show some level of control, and if they didn't like it, there was some rejection. At 18 months of age, rejecting started to be more common, and you saw more rejecting behaviors emerge. Children had enough motor control to dodge away from the spoon, to bat the spoon away, to cry and to vocalize when they didn't like things. And by 24 months of age, it was often rejected, and rejecting behaviors were quite prevalent. So clearly there was an age-related effect in children's responses to tasting these bitter green vegetables. Now let's look at it from the mom's standpoint. Maternal ratings of how much she thought her child liked it correlated quite highly with her intention to reoffer the kale. If her child displayed some liking, she was going to say that she was going to offer this food again. And as you can see, about 2/3 of the mothers said it was likely or very likely that they would offer this food again. So the majority responded decently to it. Child liking and intention to reoffer was negatively associated with the behaviors that you might expect. The children avoiding the spoon, crying, or spitting out the kale in particular. And it was positively associated with the number of successful bites or the amount that children ate and how quickly and rapidly they ate it. So experimentally, getting your child to eat and having your child like the food is what counts for moms. When we talked to mothers in our qualitative brief interviews afterwards to find out what they knew about repeated exposure and what their priorities were for feeding their children, moms told us they know about repeated exposure. They know that you should offer a food more than once to try to encourage your child to like it, but they don't think of it the same way that we as scientists or professionals think about repeated exposure. They say if a child rejects a food, they'll just take a break. Or alternatively, they'll fix that food in a different fashion. Interestingly, moms also reported that they believed that taste buds change. We heard this over and over again, that since taste buds change with development, they believed that one day their child would wake up and like these foods because of the taste bud change. And I think that's fascinating. There doesn't seem to be any support in the literature that I can find for taste buds changing. And then mothers reiterated what we heard in the survey. Some mothers said, I don't have time to waste on foods that my child doesn't like. So if they don't like it the first time, I'm moving on. And we had a spectrum of replies all the way up to, this food's important to me. This is what our family eats. They're going to eat what we eat, and I'm never giving up. So the number of times that mothers are willing to hang in there to offer a rejected food varies considerably across individuals. Mothers' priorities for feeding is that they want feeding to be a happy experience. And I'm going to tell you that by the time the child is 18 to 24 months of age, it's not that happy, at least when you're offering a difficult to like food. But having it be happy is important to mothers. Getting children to eat enough to be healthy and to grow well was very important to them, and that the foods that they offer to them should supply good nutrition. Those are mom's priorities. Interestingly, when we asked mothers how they feel when their child rejects a food, what they told us was that it was just sort of a fact of life. Most were fairly indifferent to it. Now, we did have some people who said it was kind of amusing. And on the other end of the spectrum, it was annoying and frustrating and saddening. But most replied, well, it's just how it goes, and I'm optimistic that if I hang in there, it'll change someday in the future. So it's not as negative of an experience as we might have imagined. In closing, I think there's some things for us as a profession to think about in helping mothers translate what we know about in the lab about repeated exposure into viable methods that will work for them to use at home. The first thing I think we ought to think about is, what does it mean to be responsive when a child clearly doesn't like a food? What are responsive reactions to that on the part of mothers? Do you just ignore it and keep offering it, particularly when they're young and they're likely to take another bite anyway? Do you distract them with something else? Do you just take away the food and give them something that they like better? I think that last circumstance often happens. And what we know from the child development literature, at least in terms of developing self-regulation of emotion, is that children who were 18 months of age and had moms who tried to make it all better when the child was upset about something or tried to remove something that was disappointing, at 30 months of age, those children displayed lesser self-regulation than the others who had mothers who, when they were younger, either were very dispassionate about the situation or let the child calm down on their own. I think this has interesting implications for how children respond to novel foods. Perhaps they have to learn to tolerate the fact that not everything tastes great the first time that they encounter it, and that is part of the learning. Another thing to think about is it effective to take a break? In repeated exposure experiments in the laboratory, we don't talk about taking breaks, and we certainly don't talk about fixing the food in different ways, because we think once you fix it in a different way, it's really a different food for the child. So is taking a break effective? And if so, what interval should that be? From moms in our study, when we asked them, well, how long of a break would you take? It varied from days to weeks to months, and even some said years before they would come back to it. So what is an effective break? I'm curious to know if taste buds do change. The women that we had in our study certainly believed that they did. And how do they come by this notion? And is that something that they're hanging their hopes on, that there will be some physiological change that magically will result in their children accepting a wider variety of foods? I think that's important for us to follow up on. Towards the end of what I'm thinking about is when an infant grimaces or gapes or expresses a negative reaction to the food, they often will still take more bites. Is it okay and responsive to continue to offer a food when children clearly display that they don't like it? How important is it that children like all the foods that they're given, or that they like a new food? And lastly, is there a critical window for early flavor exposure? There are a few studies out there now that suggest that early variety impacts later acceptance of a variety of foods. I believe that we need to understand this more fully, and to understand in that early 6-month period when children are likely to consume most anything that's offered to them, is it the critical period for that early flavor exposure? And will that have an impact on how they accept foods of the table later? I want to thank my study team who worked incredibly hard to gather all these data and to analyze them. And the last thing that I'll leave you with that I think is important for us all to consider is the mission that we have. And ours at the Children's Eating Lab at University of Colorado is to understand why kids eat the way they do, and how we can help families do better with encouraging healthy eating habits for their children. Thank you.